Ready. Good morning.
Morning, Rochelle.
How are
How are
you?
you? Good, good.
Good,
Thank you.
good. Will you please tell us your name?
I'm Lawrence Baxter.
And can you share a little bit about yourself so we can get to know you a little bit better? Anything that you feel comfortable sharing with us?
Sure, sure. Well, right now, of course, I'm a professor at Duke Law School, but I grew up in South Africa during the rise and height of apartheid. I was there until 25. Then I went to study in England, came back to South Africa, practiced law for a while. Then I became an academic, teaching in a law school in South Africa. And then I came to the United States in 1985 to join Duke as a visitor, and was then invited to stay permanently. And I stayed at Duke until end of 1994. But I realized the areas that I was teaching in, mostly a special area of administrative law for me, which was banking regulation, had evolved so fast that I needed experience on the ground, as it were. I'd been doing consulting for the federal government on the savings and loan crisis, and I realized that the industry was changing very fast. So I joined Wachovia on a sabbatical. Wachovia was the old big southeastern bank and very revered. And I joined on the business side to work for the CFO. And then they asked me to stay. So I left Duke, and I was at Wachovia for a number of years. We merged with First Union, and I moved from Winston-Salem to Charlotte. And then I stayed in Charlotte until 2008, the end of 2008. And Duke invited me back to come and visit again. I had been a tenured professor at Duke, but I came back as a visitor to teach about the financial crisis, which had turned everybody upside down, including us. And I stayed at Duke, and I'm still at Duke. And so lots of experiences in South Africa and the United States that I constantly reflect on.
And one of the things I know about you, and I think you would agree, is that your expertise in financial matters is just really phenomenal. And as we're looking at the evolution of finance, so we're going more to financial technology. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that means and how does that play in a capitalistic society that has always been based on cash?
Well, it took me a long time to really understand the full perspective. So, for example, when I was practicing in South Africa, finance was a very boring field, and it was somewhat ugly because as a young attorney, it mostly involved debt collecting practice for me, which meant that one went after some of the poorest people in society. I did learn one thing at that time that I often reflect upon, which is how utterly false the narrative is that poor people don't repay their debts. Yeah. They were far more reliable than the wealthier, more affluent people that we used to collect from. In fact, I remember with some sadness, elderly black gentleman who must have been a laborer, I think, all his life, coming in every 2 weeks with a small amount of cash to pay us, and thinking to myself, here we are, we've been going after this company for some time, and we've been given every lie under the sun, and yet this man who could least afford it honored his debts. So I thought about that a lot, but I didn't have much other perspective on finance. I actually had a slight distaste for it. What stimulated my interest in the United States was an invitation by a federal government agency to consult on some court cases that had been reached about in the very early stage of the savings and loan crisis. And I learned about the enormous amount of rogues and scam artists in the industry. In fact, actually started classes at Duke on it, and I had authors of the books relating to the scandals on the savings and loan crisis come down and talk to the students, and some of it was just breathtaking. It was as if, one time one of the CEOs of a southern savings and loan company in Texas, in fact, It was called Sunbelt Savings, and it had acquired the nickname Gunbelt Savings. And the CEO called his savings and loan a cash ATM. That, in other words, it really got me intrigued, and I started to teach bank regulation as a special area of what was more generally administrative law, and I found it very fascinating. But when I went into the banking industry itself, I didn't reflect a lot about the position of finance in society. I was so busy focusing on trying to be good at what I was doing. And I actually had a wonderful diversion, wonderful in the sense that it was new, and that was I'd learned at Duke about the internet. We had a person at that time who was called a systems engineer, which now I think has been completely subdivided into many different disciplines. Absolutely. And he and I were sitting looking at my computer and watching the 1200 baud modem printing out green digits on the screen. And I said to him, this is so laborious. I don't know if this is ever going to work. And he said, well, he said, I've got some good news for you. He said, I've been reading about something, I think it's called Mosaic, that's going to come out next year. And it's going to make things easier. Well, of course, that was the beginning of the browsers and Netscape and Explorer and all the way through to Safari and Chrome and so on. And the entire world changed. It was at that change point that I went to Wachovia, and nobody there was interested in the subject. They were all mainframe technology people. They all scorned the internet. And I got very lucky in that because I went on and on about it, I was asked to create an e-commerce division. We called it e-business at the time. And so the rest of my career there was building that into what became ultimately a very big division. And the only societal justice element that I really focused on was in employment itself. The bank was very good at that stage and relative to the times in diversity hiring. Mm-hmm. So every week when we had a division meeting, I would talk about the importance of it. And I think I learned some of that from Duke, but I also learned it as somebody coming to America, in which I remember thinking the heartbeat and soul of America went up the Mississippi from New Orleans, and jazz, all those things were the true American forms. Not, much as I like classical music, much of that was imported, or in fact, all of it was imported until the modern day classical composers. But if you wanted to say what was quintessentially American music, it was jazz and it was the blues. And I started to realize that the Rolling Stones borrowed all their blues music from African Americans. And so I would use that theme and say, because we had many people who were hostile to the idea of diversity, the notion, you're just preferring groups not on merit, but because you're trying to look good in public and so on. And I would make the point that it made us richer. And at that time, I felt America was so much richer for its diversity and for the number of different inputs. I like to think I had some success because as recently as 2 weeks ago, I had a big Zoom reunion with my old division, and there was a lot of affection there and a lot of evolution, not nearly where we needed to get to, but a big change from when we first started. So I started to realize that. And then there was one other area that I did feel passionately about, was the Community Reinvestment Act. That's a piece of legislation that requires banks to lend or sponsor social programs proportionate to the deposits that they received from certain areas. And the idea was you can't go in and just suck out all the deposits from poor areas and go and invest them in New York. Mm-hmm. Many bankers rail against that, and certainly conservative politicians are always complaining about the Community Reinvestment Act. So I decided to do some research about it, and it was influenced by that old idea that poor people pay their debts. One of the criticisms that I used to read about was that banks are forced to make bad loans. And I thought, this doesn't sound right to me. So I started to look at the Controller of the Currency's annual reports and the ratio of bad debts or default lending to deposit taking. And it turns out, and this remains true to the present day, that CRA lending is some of the safest lending you can have. And that's not just in that category, it's across the board. The biggest write-offs go to people like, we know who has gone bankrupt a few times. And Community Reinvestment Act lending is not so much not profitable as inconvenient for institutions that are set up. And so I used to speak very strongly about that, and I'd hear some bankers starting to go on and on. Bankers are among the biggest whiners of all, but they go on and on and on about how the government is forcing them to do this and forcing them to do that, of course, ignoring the fact that they only exist by virtue of government. Yeah. I would refute that. I'd say, go have a look. I remember vividly having a debate with a relative who made the same statement. And I said, I will get you the data. And I did. Didn't change any views, but the fact is, so I started to realize that there was an awful lot of subtle, we say institutional racism, sort of unconscious racism going on. Of course, when I came back to Duke, I became more and more aware of it because it gives you a chance to think as an academic, and you have to explain things at levels to students that you wouldn't have time to in business. And when you do, the very explanations themselves educate you. Mm-hmm. So then, one thing led to another. Now, I think we're very much more aware, not as aware as we should because of the systemic and institutional nature of things, but I now see, for example, last year, my colleague Lee Reiners invited Aaron Klein to come and talk about real-time payments, meaning no delays in the processing of payments. And I said to him, because Klein's thesis is that if we had real-time payments, this would greatly help the poor. And I was very skeptical. I thought, well, come on, why does it matter that there's a delay in payments? Well, he came down and he talked, and it blew me away. Yeah. When I realized, of course, those of us who are affluent have credit cards that give us rewards. We don't need to have the money to make the purchases. We don't need to wait 4 or 5 days between getting paid and actually seeing the balance in our bank accounts. We don't need to go to payday lenders to bridge us across the divide. We don't need to have an all-cash economy if we don't have a bank account. Right. The list goes on. And I came out of there and I said to Lee, wow, I had no idea of the social justice and racial justice significance of something as seemingly simple as real-time payments. Yeah. So, I think I like to think I think differently now than I did. And certainly than I did for most of the time in South Africa, growing up under apartheid.
I think that I was at that meeting you were with Aaron Klein, and he and
I remember,
we have become very good friends. And I always ask him questions about payday lending and all that stuff, the interest rates, or if you go cash your check because you don't have a bank account, how much these companies take out of your little bit of money so you can have cash. And a part of that goes back to what I asked you earlier, like specifically for Black person. I'm 61 and I was raised in the rural South, and most Blacks I knew did not trust banks. They did not trust banks to manage or so they'd have the money under the mattress, all the money is stored somewhere in the house.
Aftermath, yeah.
Right, and so now as we are evolving and we now are willing to put our money in the bank if we have, what society would say good credit or credit enough that a bank will open an account for you. And then you introduce technologies such as algorithms and artificial intelligence. So you've got all these things. To add to that, you got redlining, you've got gentrification, you've got all these other things that seem like they're systematically aimed at the poor, just aimed completely at the poor, because they're the people that are least going to be able to participate in these things. And as you look at it, you kind of say, well, okay, well, what is it that society is saying even in the 21st century?
Well, it's interesting that you say it seems specifically aimed at the poor. And this brings me to something that I'm sad about. You asked right at the beginning about the relationship of finance to societal justice and in particular racial justice. And I've thought about why is it that redlining evolved when it was at the hands of people who would have been horrified if you said they were deliberately discriminating. It's the profit motive. You can't make as much money given the way you approach things, meaning that you're geared up toward big companies and so on, by lending in those areas. So redlining, I think at the first conscious level, was one of, well, you know, let's not waste time in those areas. It would be dressed up in sort of more sophisticated language. And ironically would be done by people who, if you said to them they were being racist, they would say, I'm not a racist. You know, you can almost hear the next sentence. Some of my best friends are, you know, how it goes.
Yep.
Which takes me into the deeply systemic nature of this, of the challenge that we have, which is, I grew up in South Africa, as I mentioned, under apartheid. I was utterly unaware even of apartheid until I was about 15 or 16, which sounds horrifying, but the truth is we lived in a bubble. We lived in a world in which everything seemed orderly and natural, and it was the way things were, and it was not something overtly created by government. Well, we were also taught a very distorted view of history because government controlled education. And so we were taught that the heroes were some of the leading figures of the apartheid movement. We were not told about the horrific treatment of all non-white voters in South Africa who, in fact, up to a certain point had the vote. We were not told about the fact that the British abolished slavery in 1832 as the trigger for the Great Trek. Rather, the Great Trek was celebrated as a great event. The Great Trek was, in fact, those who refused to give up their slaves, leaving the Cape and trekking north. So the whole history was, it was in cotton wool. And I remember it starting to dawn on me in my latter years of high school, but it required events that jolted me out of my way of life. And then the big change was when I went into mandatory conscription into the army, because then for the first time I was exposed to the mainstream of Afrikaner apartheid thinking, and I was horrified. But I still had a confused view for a few years until I went to England and was able to look at it from afar. I remember, it sounds crazy, but when I washed, we didn't have dishwashers. When I was washing dishes as a student at night in England, I would reflect on all of this. And it was like discovering things at the age of 26 for the first time. It made me realize that when it's systemic, and when one only has the most distorted and even shallow view of history, it is no surprise that so many people will continue to say things like, I'm not racist, all lives matter, Confederate statues in front of the courthouse are merely recording our history. There's no inkling of what's really going on. They don't know the history. They don't know when those statues were put up. They don't know why all lives matter is in the circumstances really insulting, let alone insensitive. And they can't because they're locked in their bubbles. We see a similar thing across our political divide, that it's like people live in different worlds, and it depends on where they are taking their information from. I think there may be a constant urge to try to rationalize one situation. I'm sure it's subconscious most of the time. I'm sure that, and having worked with people with fairly right-wing views, this is not all bankers, but some of them do have and did have fairly right-wing views. What I learned was they genuinely think that they are being honest and sincere and trying to do the right thing. They're just not equipped to do it because they don't know enough. Rather, what they've done is they've rationalized for themselves where they are in society and said, this is the right order of things. And so systemic and historical issues are just so riddle the challenges that we have.
Well, what you described in South Africa kind of relates to slavery. And I'd read something someone had written recently. For 240 years, every member of an enslaved family added to the wealth of the plantation owner for 244
Yeah,
years.
yeah,
And when we finally got to Emancipation Proclamation, we still had forms of slavery, and where you couldn't really get out of debt. So, you could lease some land from a white plantation owner and become a sharecropper. But literally, and I think you said this earlier, almost every instance of our world is based on some kind of economic or capitalistic thing. And people get caught in their thoughts about that and they don't really think about it. The problem just is, for me, specifically with slavery and even the Native Americans, indigenous people and such, is the cruelty. Why was it necessary to be so brutally cruel? And is that because they're in a bubble, or is that self-preservation? What is that? And I've asked a lot of people, is that just simply white privilege, white supremacy, white power? What is that?
right. No, I mean, those are sort of such big questions, but I'd give two sort of short answers to try to explain it to myself. The first is that we often read how psychologically we separate ourselves from other groups, and in so doing, we have the ability to diminish the humanity of the other groups. So in war, we hate the people on the other side. Aliens, we call immigrants aliens, and we also use the word alien in other ways that suggest they're not real people. We, of course, stratify racism in that way. So Black people are not quite the same as us. I remember being told in South Africa that I should understand that Black people don't really fall in love. Yeah, I mean, it's stupefying, but I think that's not an uncommon view among people who are deeply embedded in the white system. And when you think like that, you don't feel the cruelty that you're inflicting. It's sort of like, well, they were made for that. They don't feel pain as much. In fact, Montesquieu, the French philosopher, developed the theory about the feeling pain. So that's the one thing. That's disassociation from the other. The other is disassociation from historical periods. So if I talk about reparations, I hear many people say, just like Justice Scalia said, I had nothing to do with slavery. My
Right.
father was an immigrant.
Right.
Why are you telling me that I must pay? And I say to them, but you walk into the Capitol or the White House or the state capitals, every one of them was built by slaves or by their immediate descendants. How can you say you don't benefit every single day? To a huge degree. It's not even just sort of, oh, well, maybe there's a little bit left over. It's like everything we do. And then they immediately say, that may have been true in the past, but we need to get over that. And so there's a disassociation. It's sort of like saying, okay, that's to the extent that they even acknowledge it. As you know, with the battle over statues, what I always say is, never forget the South was defeated, but not persuaded.
Exactly.
So in the minds of many of those people who say it's denigrating or erasing, that's the other funny phrase it's used, it's erasing history. They are fueled to some extent by a subconscious belief that there was a virtuous war. When I first got to America, I was told by one of the Duke professors, long now dead, it wasn't a civil war, it was the war between the states.
Yeah.
Which was a legitimizing, it eliminated the treason element of the whole thing.
Right.
And it, I had a very elderly visitor in South Africa before I even came to America. He was the Venerian Professor of Law at Oxford, which is the most distinguished law chair in the entire British Commonwealth. Mm-hmm. He had retired near me, and I found out. And so I contacted him, and he was a delightful, very elderly man. He was very lonely. He had gone to live there because his daughter was there, and really, he was just by himself, other than for his daughter. So I invited him to come and speak at the law school I was teaching at, and he was able to do that. He came in, he gave a lovely speech. He was, getting on a bit and not very sharp, but it was just a great honor for us to have him there. And then when I was driving him back, he lived about 40 miles away. he talked about America, and he said, Lawrence, when you go there, they will try to tell you it was not about slavery. He said, don't believe a word of it. He had spent time in America, and he said, I had listened to this, and there's every different rationalization under the sun about why it was an outright treason to disobey the federal government, and why it was not about slavery, the war between the states and other euphemisms that he used. So I think the statute problem is exacerbated by the genuine belief of a lot of young people brought up in the system that they did nothing wrong and nobody in the past did anything wrong, that in fact it was the Northerners who transgressed on their rights of the Southern states. And that's why they talk about erasing history. They don't understand the glorification of the Confederacy with those statutes.
I agree with you completely. I think, but to me, you know, like I talked to the mayor, I talked to Durham's mayor a couple of days ago. He and I had one of these chats, you know, and he said that he and several other governors are getting together to think about reparations.
Right.
You know, I think the scars to Black and brown people are so deep and so intrinsic into their philosophies. It's hard to understand. Like, you know, even going to simple things at elementary school, can you trust this white person has my best interest at heart? You know, and I'm a huge, I think I have every book ever written about Abraham Lincoln. And what, even to this day, after all of that reading, I still don't know whether was he for states' rights or was he anti-slavery, which was he, you know, and nothing I've read has given me a clear view of that. And so as a 61-year-old Black woman, when you talked about Mosaic and Netscape and all those things, I was in that world, but I was the only person that looks like me. And now it's 2020, and now 90% of the meetings or conferences I go to, I'm the only person that looks like me. And so I'm the double whammy, right? I'm Black and I'm female. So there's that. And and when you kind of try to process what that means to be Black or brown in America, it is exactly what you just described. I can put myself in this bubble and justify my actions and my behaviors. Why a police officer could put his knee on a man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and put his hand in his pocket, because really we are seen as two separate and distinct things. And the Blacker or browner you are, the less human you are.
Well, and there's the rationalization kicking in again. It's just a few bad apples.
Right.
An inability to engage in systemic thinking. I don't think it's deliberate. I think it's well, it is with some of the opportunists among them. It's more just a cognitive inability. But you reminded me about something else about South Africa versus the United States. I do feel like I'd like to talk about, if I may. When I got to America, I was shocked to learn from friends that we had made fairly quickly in Chapel Hill that the first integrated prom that their daughter went to had only taken place something like 4 or 5 years before we got here.
Wow.
I was horrified because I had become a student of the Warren Court and a civil rights movement, thought, you know, all the problems are solved. And so I only then started to realize how recent and deep it was. I had a clue about it because the Homeland legislation, which started out as what were called the Native Reservation Acts in South Africa, were copied almost word for word from the Indian Reservation Acts in the United States. So I realized there was a commonality, but how deeply common, I did not know until I started to spot when things were dog whistles, because I got used to that in South Africa. And my relatives said, oh, you're too sensitive. You grew up in South Africa. And I said, that's precisely why I can see it.
Right.
And it was so blatant to me. And then, of course, things evolved. But there was something else from South Africa that I wish Americans' circumstances would lead to this being taken more seriously. Bishop Desmond Tutu, and there were some of his colleagues, promoted the idea of a truth commission after apartheid. And it involves complete immunity for people who came and told the truth about what they did. Yeah. Well, you probably are aware it's been copied in many other countries. Yeah. And although South Africa has gone off the rails a little bit now because of corruption, it healed dramatically, of course, under the leadership of Nelson Mandela. But what it did was it helped to purge the past, not so much to eliminate it, but to purge the sense of guilt and denial of guilt, because these people came in and they confessed to some of the most horrific crimes. I mean, it's sort of like, how could you let somebody walk out of there with immunity when they've just admitted that they murdered 3 people on such and such a day? So it was controversial among both black and white people in South Africa. But Bishop Desmond Tutu, I put up there with Nelson Mandela as one of the great figures of history. And he and his allies were insistent that that was the only way, because they were driven, as he was, by a deep Christian belief in the power of forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And it certainly helped. Now things are getting bad again, but it's a lot of factors going on: coronavirus, corruption among the former Zuma leadership, and so on and so forth. Desperation on the part of the high number of unemployed people there, and so on. But it certainly helped to avert what I had thought for a long time was an absolutely certain explosive civil war. Yeah. I wonder if we can ever get to the stage here where we can be honest about the past, because I don't think we can deal with the reparations issue until the people who oppose it truly confront what happened and why they are themselves indebted to that past.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Lawrence, that's really brilliant. But I think that's going to, I've heard a lot of people say they're optimistic because we have more diverse protests and, more people out here doing things, and they're taking statues and flags down. I think we have a long way to go. I don't even believe we'll see it in my lifetime. Maybe my children or maybe my grandchildren, but I don't think we'll see it in my lifetime. But, I want to say one thing to you, as many times as you and I have talked about whatever we talked about, I had never understood the depth of how much you understood what I was experiencing as a Black person. And I think that if you have another career, so from banking to teaching, this next part should be about explaining what it is from the perspective that you just did here today. Because I will tell you that there's so much distrust interracially and then to other groups. And so we don't have a clear understanding. So I think what you've said here today has just been very profound. And I think it would be very helpful if that was in the public domain, not just in my chat, which, there are a lot of people who watch these things, but in a more public domain so that people could hear that. Because what you just said was just purely phenomenal. I mean, that is just amazing to hear that, because I mean, of all the white friends I have, you remember what you said earlier, you get I have Black friends, and you always take that with what exactly does that mean? So I think that having you talk about this, specifically being who you are and your leadership and the things that you've done in the financial world would really, really, really be beneficial. So call CNN and tell them that you need to come talk to them.
I would be glad to try. One thing that always inhibits me is that I'm keenly aware of the fact that when a white person starts talking about how a Black person has experienced something, there is always the question of how do you know?
Right.
You know your perspective, and that may be totally authentic, but you cannot really understand the pain. I'll give you an example very briefly. A friend of mine is a Black attorney in Durham, and when a couple of years ago, the Confederate statue at UNC when they pulled down the statue in
Durham courthouse.
Yeah. I said to her on Facebook, I said, I won't mention her name, but I said, how do you feel about that? Is it really that important? And she said, let me tell you what my day is like. And she talked about walking in and out of that courtroom, that courthouse. She said, every time I walk up there, I have a statue looking down on me, reminding me of where I come from and who's in charge.
Right.
Man, it was boom.
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah.
I think I get it. I'm sure I don't get many, many other dimensions, but I got that one. I thought, I could not live that way.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of, as a increasingly angry young man in South Africa, when I started to realize what was going on and I got back from England, I remember saying occasionally, if I was a Black person, I'd be carrying an AK-47. And, you know, of course, my family would, you know, don't even talk that way. You know, well, but this is the only way, you know, so there are these little insights that one gets, but they're very sporadic.
Yeah.
The whole life of a Black person, I always feel I can't possibly authentically speak to that, but maybe I can speak to it as a white person also in the system, because it's interactive, as it were.
And that's exactly what I mean. I mean, like, so coming from South Africa, seeing what you see, being a part of apartheid, Desmond, and all the things that you see, and what you've learned on your own time to increase your scholarship. I mean, you have a perspective that's really not clearly stated by white people. I mean, like, so I think you know this probably as well as I do. Like, but trust the right person. So I work at a university where I am a minority in every way possible. You know,
Right.
my leadership, everyone on top of me. Well, we recently hired a new library director, but there's that. But my interaction with the bigger university and the smaller university reminds me how invisible I am, how little I matter. You know, so I think somebody needs to hear what you just said, and not, you know, the however many people who subscribe to this channel will hear it if you give me permission to upload it. But I think it needs to be heard more broadly. It needs to be heard in a very, very public domain, because I think what you didn't say was what the life of a Black person was like. It was how you understood what the life of a Black person was like, and this perspective that you have. So I really do think that this is something you should, you know, really, you know, talk about, because, you know, you're well established, you're a well-known name, but to actually have that much understanding for a white person is phenomenal. Because as you said earlier, you know, you have white people who say, well, you know, it wasn't me, it was my that happened a long time ago or something. But the perspective you have is just absolutely phenomenal, Lawrence. I just will tell you, I am impressed I like even more than I did before after this. So thank you so much for doing this with me.
One has to work at it all the time, because there's a constant undertow that drags you back to that sort of sense of that everything's, you know, right and just under God's heaven, you know. So let me finish with one thing. I actually think that there is latent racism in all people born into the system. I can only speak for whites, in the sense that we use categorizations and classifications in our minds to simplify our decision making. And there's that impulse to use that classification because it's a short and easy way out. And because life is always complex all day, one has to be constantly on guard not to lapse. And I think that explains a lot of the terrible public statements that people make and then lose their jobs in that, because they just, you know, they lose control of that important ability to keep reminding themselves that they are going to use a classification that is utterly irrelevant but convenient.
Yep, exactly.
Anyway,
exactly.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this.
Me too. I have to so much. So as soon as it converts, I'll send you a link. You can watch it and tell me if it's okay to upload it. But I hope you say it's okay to upload, because I would tell you, Lawrence, it's phenomenal.
I'm sure.
Really,
I'm
really
sure
great.
I'll be fine with it. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I'll send it to you and have you look at it just to make sure, you know, we don't need to edit or anything. But it's just truly phenomenal. Out of all the people I've talked to a lot of white people. This is probably the clearest, most articulated version of understanding the differences between the racism and constructural processes that make people less or unequal. So this has just been really phenomenal. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
You're very kind, Rochelle. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll send you a copy as soon as it converts.
And feel free to edit however you like. So I've got no problem about it going up.
Okay.
I look forward to seeing it. Okay.
Okay.
Thank
you so much, Lawrence. Thank you. And have fun on the 4th. You know, have a good holiday.
Yeah. Before we go, I'll tell you another example of the constant battle against ignorance that one has to wage. And I know we're offline here, but it doesn't matter, even if we were online. I knew about Juneteenth, but not much about it. And in a very perverse way, Trump did publicize it, in that I knew it was absolutely offensive for him to be trying to hold a meeting in Oklahoma at that time. But I didn't really know a lot the celebratory element of Juneteenth. And so last Friday, the Friday before last, I joined a Juneteenth Zoom that I was invited to as part of my role in supporting some political candidates. And I was probably only one of about 5% of white people on it. It was such a wonderful experience. It was so joyful.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, my God, 90% of the population, of the white population, has no idea what Juneteenth is. So we're about to go to 4th of July. And now the 4th of July, it's a nice holiday, but it's laughable.
Right.
To treat that as, it's absolutely laughable.
Right.
And I myself did not know that until 2 weeks ago.
Well, hopefully we're always learning and evolving as much
So
as
anyway, I know I'm keeping you here, but I felt like I had to tell you that because I went out and I told my family and my son, who's very activist. He's only 16, but he's very racially aware and very activist. And often I use a phrase and he says, Dad, you don't realize that that is offensive. And then he explains to me why. I was like, oops.
Yeah.
I told him about it, and it was like, my goodness, we should be celebrating Juneteenth, the 4th of July, even as white people.
Right.
Anyway, that's it. Okay.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. I'll send you a copy as soon as it's ready. Have a great holiday. Be safe. And maybe one day before, not too long, we may be back in the building or maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, I hope so. I miss everybody. And this is nice, but it would be nice to be able to be in person again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Stay safe. And again, I'll upload. And Lawrence, we will need to do this again. I think there are 3 or 4 more questions we need to talk about. So don't be surprised if you don't get an email asking you to do another of these with me. Thank you so much.
With pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.